human beings, like our fellow primates, are tribal animals. We're hardwired that way. It's biological. We need to belong to groups. And once we connect with a group, we tend to want to cling to it and defend it and see our group as better in every way. In a fascinating recent study, children between the ages of 4 and 8 were randomly assigned to either the red group or the blue group and given T-shirts of corresponding colors. These children were then seated at computer docks and shown computer-edited images of other children, half of whom were wearing red T-shirts, the other half of whom were wearing blue T-shirts. The children were then asked for their reactions to what they were seeing, and the results were stunning. Even though these children knew absolutely nothing about the children in these images, they consistently reported that they liked the children wearing their color better, wanted to allocate more resources to people in their group, and perhaps most disturbingly, displayed systematic unconscious bias. That is, when they were told stories about these children, they displayed systematic memory distortion, tending to remember all the positive things about the children wearing their color and all the negative things about the children wearing the other color. So humans aren't just a little tribal, we're very tribal. And once we connect with a group, our identities can become oddly bound up with it. The effect is almost like a drug. We will seek to benefit our group mates even when we personally gain nothing, and we will take pleasure when out-group members fail or suffer a misfortune. Neurological studies actually show that our brains light up when we stick it to the other side. Now, tribalism is not necessarily a bad thing. Take sports, for example, which is very tribal. We all root zealously for our soccer team, our football team, our basketball team, and we want to beat everybody else, and it's fun. Tribes can also be a source of protection and support and comfort and joy. Family can be very tribal. I'll be the first to confess that I'm a very tribal person. The problem is when tribalism takes over a political system. That's when things get dangerous. When that happens, it turns politics into a zero-sum, winner-take-all contest between competing groups for political power. That's when things get dangerous, and ethnic cleansing, persecution, and genocide, these are the most extreme results of political tribalism. Even in advanced democracies like the United States or the United Kingdom, political tribalism is very dangerous because you start to see everything through your group's lens. Facts and arguments and policies don't even matter. You just defend and stick to what your side is saying no matter what, and try to take down the other side. And that's certainly what we're seeing in the United States today. We are at the point in the United States where many Americans see people who voted for the other side not just as people they disagree with and want to argue with, but as immoral, evil, un-American, which is a dangerous state of affairs. But that's not all that's happening today. What's even more troubling is that there's a special kind of tribal politics that is surging all around the world today. The so-called identity politics that Mark Lila just brilliantly discussed. Specifically, the groups and tribes that people are now increasingly sorting themselves into have very hard boundaries. These are groups that people can't move in and out of freely. So to give the opposite example, going back to sports, if you think of sports fans, the group boundaries are very soft. You can be a fan of Manchester United, anyone can be. Anyone can be a fan of the New York Yankees. You can be black, white, Asian, Arab. As long as you root for that team, you're part of the group. By contrast, identity politics tends to revolve around groups, sometimes artificially constructed, often, that are formed along racial lines or ethnic lines or gender lines. That is, groups that you have to be born into, or at least are very hard for outsiders to break into. For example, not just anyone could choose to be white, or not just anyone could choose to be ethnic Chinese. This kind of political tribalism tends to be very exclusionary, often chauvinist, and intolerant. So, for example, there are now a growing number of openly white nationalist groups in the United States who brazenly hold conferences in a way that have been unimaginable just 5 years ago. These are open groups. Similarly, we're seeing far-right anti-immigration movements spreading all over Europe, openly arguing that Europe should be for Christians only. At the same time, explicitly ethno-nationalist movements are gaining strength in Europe as well. The message is Hungary should only be for ethnic Hungarians, Poland should only be for ethnic Poles, Germany only for ethnic Germans, no foreigners. So that is all on the right. But what is unusual about this moment is that we're seeing identity politics on the left too, with equal intensity. And this is really a striking change. During the civil rights era, in the 60s and 70s, the rhetoric used by Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders was self-consciously inclusive. It was universalist. The idea was that the color of your skin shouldn't matter. We're all equals. This was also true of the international human rights movement, which gained momentum in the 80s and 90s. Again, the vision was universalist, with a focus on the dignity of every individual, as individuals, not on group rights. Today, there has been a huge change. Among progressives in the United States, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, there has been a sharp shift away from inclusivity as the watchword to a much more exclusionary approach. And I teach at Yale. I see this so dramatically on university campuses. There is so much more self-segregation now. So our black students want to do activities with just other black students. Our Asian students want to do activities with just Asian students. Same with Latino students, same with our Muslim American students, same with our gay students. I'll often try to do joint events, but there's an impulse. No, we want to do it separately. And this is what I mean by a hardening of group lines. And part of this new exclusivity is epistemological. The claim is that people outside the group cannot share in the knowledge possessed by in-group members. You cannot understand me because you're not a woman. You can't speak for me because you're not black. You can't understand me if you're not X or Y or Z. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the concept of cultural appropriation, which is constantly in the news in the West. Every day, a new celebrity gets in trouble and has to apologize. So, not long ago, it was considered a sign of multicultural openness for a Caucasian person to, for example, wear a Japanese kimono or an Indian sari, as long as you wore it respectfully. Today, that would be considered a microaggression. Not allowed to do that. Mark mentioned food. Cultural appropriation is extended to cuisines also. There's now a strong sense, you often hear, if you are not ethnic Thai, you aren't allowed to cook Thai food. If you are a white person, you should not be able to cook a Mexican burrito. And the idea is that these are our group symbols. They are our traditions. They are our patrimony. And others, especially in more privileged positions, have no right to them. Now, the next question is why? Why? Why is the world now, at this moment, descending into these particular forms of tribal politics? What's different about today? And my answer tracks what Mark said. First, I think, two factors. The first has to do with immigration and the dramatic demographic shifts that we're seeing around the world. So going back to the United States, for 200 years, America was dominated economically, politically, culturally by a white majority. Now, obviously, white is a social construct, and who counted as white in the United States has always been a moving target. But nevertheless, that was the basic dynamic. Today, however, for the first time in US history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status at the national level. Most predictions say that by around 2044 or maybe 2050, whites will become a minority in the United States. This is already true in California, Texas, our most populous states, Washington, D.C., and many counties and cities. So the result, why is this important? The result is that in America today, every group feels threatened. It used to just be the minorities, but now it's not just minorities who feel threatened, whites feel threatened. A recent study showed that today in America, over half of white Americans now feel that they are subject to more discrimination than racial minorities. Again, it's not just religious minorities like Muslims and Jews who feel threatened, as they historically always have been, but now Christians feel threatened. You'll see in the political rhetoric talk of the war on the Bible. You're seeing a similar dynamic in Europe. Because of the large influx of migrants from the Middle East, North Africa, the former communist bloc, many Europeans today, from France to the Netherlands to Austria to Greece, feel that they are in danger of losing their cultural identity, of being swallowed up by foreigners who are taking over their country. And studies show that it's when groups feel threatened, that's when they retreat into tribalism. That's when they become more insular, they close ranks, they become more defensive, more us versus them. And this is why we are now seeing explicit identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum. So that's the first factor, immigration and demographic changes. The second factor that I think is contributing to this turmoil, believe it or not, is democracy itself. This is something that I've been writing about for about 20 years now. Because of our own idiosyncratic history, Americans tend to romanticize democracy. They think that elections are the answer to everything. But under certain conditions, especially when economic inequality tracks deep pre-existing ethnic, religious, and sectarian divides, democracy can become an engine of political tribalism. It can actually catalyze ethnic or sectarian conflict by giving rise to demagogues who deliberately scapegoat and incite anger, highlighting differences, pitting, for example, Serbs against Croats, or Sunnis against Shia, or Hutus against Tutsi, or Indonesians against Chinese. Now, what's ironic, given that the United States has long been the biggest proponent of democracy, is that I think that we're getting a little bit of a taste of our own medicine right now. Many in the United States, as I'm sure you all know, especially cosmopolitan elites living in America's multicultural cities, were horrified by what happened in the 2016 presidential election. Completely caught off guard, horrified, in which Donald Trump, somebody with no political experience, swept to power by tapping into deep veins of anger and resentment, especially among working-class white males who feel they are losing control of their country to minorities and immigrants. And what's interesting is that what we're starting to see in many Western democracies, including the United States, is that these countries are starting to display destructive political dynamics that historically we much more typically associated with developing countries. For example, ethno-nationalist movements, the rise of strongmen and lurches towards authoritarianism, the erosion of trust in institutions and electoral outcomes, and above all, the transformation of democracy into an engine of zero-sum political tribalism. So what is the way forward? How do we fight back, or at least try to de-escalate the bitter, intense political tribalism that is roiling and starting to tear apart countries around the world. There's obviously no simple answer, and every country's path will have to reflect its own history and culture. But I want to introduce a concept, which I discuss in detail in my book, Political Tribes, and that's the idea of a supergroup. Not a superpower, a supergroup. And the idea is incredibly simple. To be a supergroup, a country has to satisfy two simple conditions. The first is that it has to have a strong, overarching national, collective identity capable of inspiring patriotism and loyalty. So, for example, America or China or Estonia. And a first step in that direction, important step, is generating the kind of collective sense of civic duty that the president of this country is admirably trying to do. So that's the first condition, a strong, overarching collective identity. But to be a supergroup, a country also has to satisfy a second condition, and that is that it has to allow subgroup identities, ethnic, religious, tribal, cultural. It has to allow those subgroup identities to freely flourish. And it's actually surprisingly rare to find countries that satisfy both conditions. You'll often find countries that satisfy one or the other. And I think that the United States, as the quintessential land of immigrants, is an example, at least at our best, of a supergroup. It wasn't always. It took a civil war and a civil rights movement, but at its best, America is a country where you can be Irish American or Iraqi American or Syrian American or Cuban American or Chinese American and intensely patriotic to the larger country at the same time. Now, I think that we're at a dangerous moment in the United States because being a supergroup is a fragile status, and we're in danger of losing that. But moving away from the United States, more generally, I think the concept of a supergroup is one that can be very helpful to many multi-ethnic nations around the world, including in the Middle East. And I think it's helpful because it doesn't require forced assimilation or trying to get rid of tribes. I think there's a lot of talk of a cosmopolitan liberal identity, which is a beautiful vision, but I think it's kind of impossible in some ways to expect people to just get rid of their tribal or group identities. It would be like telling people to stop loving their sports team, just like all soccer players in general. What are the chances of that? So again, what's key about this idea of a supergroup is it means that you do not have to choose between having a strong, group-transcending collective identity with a sense of civic duty and multiculturalism. You can have both. To conclude, I'd like to end on a hopeful note. There are lots of depressing studies out there about how diversity generates conflict, but there's also a large body of interdisciplinary research showing that if people can just be pulled out of their tribes and made to interact with each other as human beings, enormous progress can be made. So how do we do that? At the personal level, I think it means finding ways to get people out of their groupthink social media bubbles, where you're just reinforcing the same message, and to really get people to listen and talk to people from other political tribes. And the good news is that if you just look beyond the loudest voices, the shrillest voices, you will see that there are growing numbers of grassroots organizations and institutions trying to do just this all over the world. My favorite in the United States is, so Donald Trump's slogan was Make America Great Again. There's a wonderful group in the United States called Make America Dinner Again. And it takes people who voted for President Trump and those violently opposed to him and brings them together in extended dinners. And it's amazing, the kind of progress. So that's at the more personal level. At the global level, the challenge is to promote institutions and leaders that will work to bring together and tie different tribes and different nations together, rather than pitting them against each other. And the World Government Summit is a perfect example of this, which is just another reason that I'm thrilled and honored to be participating in this year's summit. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and thank you for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.